Thank you so much.
Thank you, Head.
Now that's, Neil, I was going through the last point, which is the last point you made, which was the first point I made, which is grammar in general. This is the fun part. I mean, as a tutor, when you see the face of the trainees crumbling when you're telling them the next teaching practice is a grammar lesson, and automatically they have this fear. Now, you mentioned, Neil, some of the reasons that you thought grammar was so scary.
I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to put it out there that there might be a useful distinction to be made between, and forgive me for using unhelpful, old-fashioned, and not very politically correct terms.
We will try.
But I'm not sure when we think about teaching English on a global level that it's necessarily helpful to think of teachers as just one monolithic group, because I think the challenges facing teachers that come from different contexts, and this is where I use the term native, non-native, may begin to show some differences. It's my experience of working with teachers in the UK who are from the UK, the so-called non-native teachers, that they often fear grammar because they weren't taught it at school.
Definitely.
Some, a small minority, often those that went to quite traditional schools, who might have studied foreign languages, and in particular, the dead languages, Latin and classical Greek, may have a bit more of a kind of understanding of what grammar is as a system, although of course we know that the attempt to describe English, as it was originally the case through the medium of Latin, was entirely unhelpful, whereas non-native teachers who have studied the language and its grammar may have different ideas about and effective responses to the idea of teaching grammar. Would a typical native teacher, if she exists, and a typical non-native teacher share the same fears about teaching grammar for the same reasons? Perhaps that's a question we should ask of the small group of people that we have here live today, plus the larger group of people who are going to be watching the recording. Is grammar scary? Cristina, you've uniquely placed that you've been running CELTAs all over the world recently. Yes. Do you see a difference?
There is. I mean, there is, and even my personal experience brought this about. I moved to England when I was 11. I had, you know, and so I learned from. I didn't learn from the school. I learned straight from going shopping and stuff. So my knowledge of grammar was non-existent. I became a bilingual. I became bilingual nearly in a year or two. So I never learned the rules. Then when I moved from London to other countries and I decided to become a teacher, even though I was non-native, but because I learned the language by immersion and not by the rules, I just was, what's happening? What are the rules? What are those things? I had no idea. I was like, what? I don't want to teach grammar. So even that is just basically how you were taught. And yes, on the CELTAs that I've been doing, certain regions of the world, I don't want to be stereotypical, I'm just saying in general, do tend to put more emphasis on the grammar part of learning English. And therefore, when you get these candidates on the CELTA or on any other teacher training course that I've done, they have on point. Their knowledge of grammar is even beyond mine at points. We're talking linguistic, level, master level. So
Russian teachers of English very often.
I was thinking about that, but I didn't dare say it. But yes, definitely. And then when you go, and it's true, when you go to what is typically known as native speakers, that look of panic, and you have to remind them that all you have to know, and I think one of the fear with grammar is that you have to know everything about the whole system. And you have to make them understand, and this is something we have to understand as teachers. You're not supposed to know everything. This is not, you're not the font of all knowledge. And again, this is that paradigm shift of the teachers being the font of all knowledge to, you know, giving the knowledge to the students. We're not supposed to know everything. So that's why I say to the native speakers is, just learn the grammar point you have to teach on that day. And that's it. Take it as a step-by-step process. Do not get overwhelmed by the wealth of knowledge that you're supposed to acquire. You're not supposed to acquire it. You're supposed to know your subject for that day. That's it.
Plus, of course, and I'd like to come back to Valentina's point, but there is the added layer in all of this, that what we teach, and I think your example about conditionals is such a good one, that what we teach is a commercialized pedagogical version of English. And the tyranny, is that the right word, of course books and of publishers that are driving teachers globally in a certain direction in order to commodify, to use Scott Thornberry's idea, that grammar can be, you know, grammar McNuggets. It's the McDonald's approach of, here's a little bit of grammar that you can learn today and then you can use tomorrow, which we all know isn't right. You know, second language acquisition blows that one out of the water.
Yes, yes.
But course books continue to package grammar in that way. And compare that with that lovely example of, what was it? I wouldn't have bought, what was that first example? I wouldn't have bought that car if I hadn't known it was broken. And you just think, well, what kind of grammar is that? And you just look at Amazon, eBay reviews, TripAdvisor, native speakers all around the country, so-called getting it wrong. No, they are working with different levels of English, different Englishes.
Exactly. That's the whole thing. It's the Englishes that we have to be aware of, and be also aware that we shouldn't just target, I mean, like the McNuggets of the course book, like, you know, the teachers, when they turn around to the students going, why don't you remember this? We taught it yesterday. And you're like, how is that feasible if, when you know that in order for anything to go from short memory to long-term memory has to be reviewed in different ways,
time and time again, yeah.
God knows, I mean the number 7 is floating around, but that's not even remotely close to it. So yes, those different Englishes, and nearly, even if we go further to that, it's like that difference between pedagogical English, like descriptive,
Descriptivism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. What exactly are we meant to be teaching as teachers? I mean, it's so hard to go against the course book. The course book is so amazingly well done, and you just have to do that little nugget of the day, and then that way you're done. But I think this is part of the vision of, and the aim of Masterclass is to be able for us to go beyond this by through these videos to go, well, yes, but okay, there's another way, which doesn't mean don't use the course book. Goodness me, no, we have to, because we don't have the time. Let's be honest, we don't have the time to recreate everything. However, there are little things that you can change, little approaches you can try, even using the same text or using the same grammar point.
So if I understand you correctly, what we're trying to do in terms of finding a principled approach to the teaching of grammar in classrooms around the world is not necessarily to be entirely radical and throw out course books and throw out pedagogical grammar, but actually to raise awareness that there are parallels here, that the course book is for many teachers a very valuable asset, but to also understand that the wealth of the language, and it's not just English. In my experience of learning French and Italian as 2 examples, the course book vision of English will be, if you like, a safe little garden inside a slightly more wild garden, and beyond which there is a jungle, in which different varieties of the language coexist, should be valued equally, and it's for the teacher to make a decision, if they have the full knowledge of where they're going to set the parameters or the boundaries. Is it the tightness of the course book, or are we going to show the students that there is more?
Definitely.
And for the students who are going to go in and live in one of those countries, or are going to work or study alongside people who are using English as a contact language, who are native speakers, that they should be tolerant of forms that they may not have yet seen in a course book.
Definitely.
Is that a sensible way of looking
at it?
at it?
It is. I mean, the idea is basically that as we grow as teachers, we will expand from that little corner, that little nice garden. But at the beginning, we do not have the confidence nor the knowledge to do this. And nobody's asking us to do this. This is the same thing as the CELTA. We teach you certain things. Go with that. Then as we grow as teachers and as we get that knowledge, because that knowledge comes from, it is not innate, whether you are native or non-native, it just comes from teaching. Then and you know, from personal professional development. As you get a little bit more confident and knowledgeable, then you can expand or even go out of that little garden into the jungle, you know. And the same principle when you go to from CELTA to, you know, those in between courses where you start thinking CELTA might not be the end all be all, and then Delta comes and blows your mind and goes, oh my God, but what you told me, and you go, haha, yes, what I told you was different. So this is the idea, is that we, and this is something very important, teachers need to grow, keep growing professionally. Don't think one diploma is the end all be all. You have to keep progressing, because this, otherwise at one point or another, first of all, you're going to have like teaching fatigue. It's going to be the same lesson over and over, but also you're going to be thinking there's something I'm missing. So as you grow, then you can expand from that little garden. And going back to that example that you were saying about the wood, if you would do this, I would be very happy. Now, how many times have I heard this, you know, going vegetable shopping on Church Street? And, you know, when I came here and I started teaching, I had a friend of mine, you know, non-native, that said, you know, Cristina, normally you speak English quite well, but why do you keep making that mistake? And I was like, that ain't a mistake, darling. And she was like, yes, it is. I was like, show me the rule. And she did show me the rule. And I was like, how come everybody back home says that then? And this is what, and that was a little while ago. And that kept me going like, I'm sorry, Londoners don't speak English? And I was like, it just blew me away. But then it kind of opened my mind to the fact that we have to keep growing. We can't just say, okay, what's in the book? However, the book is essential at the beginning, then we grow from it. We go from teaching what is prescriptive grammar, more from the pedagogy, and then slowly we start introducing aspects of, you know, like we were saying, it wasn't, I used the wrong term. I said the lexical approach to conditional. What I meant was a lexical approach to the conditional, because the lexical approach is more as chunks of language, but a lexical approach of grammar can only be taught once the teacher feels at ease doing it. You shouldn't impose it as a director of studies or as a coordinator. You can't impose a certain vision of, you know, how it should be, because it is not feasible. And I'm sure you know this, Neil, in your position.
I was, as you were talking, reminded of my mother, who very interestingly, it was something that she said, and it comes back to this prescriptive, descriptive divide or way of thinking. And my mother, albeit that she was in certain respects very modern and very European, you know, she never wanted me to think of myself as English. She wanted me to think of myself as a member of Europe. She had spent years learning and then using French in work and wanted the same for me. And I think that's why I became a linguist. But in spite of that kind of, you know, you need to speak 3 languages, Neil, or otherwise you're not, you know, you're not really valid, was also incredibly Victorian. And I remember her saying to me, I don't get this of. The phrase is, you should have. So, you know, for
yes,
past modals, as far as her as far as she was concerned, contracted forms, should have, would have, could have, were incorrectly pronounced if people didn't model should have, could have, would have. She sounded a bit like the Queen, frankly. And as I became a teacher, I was like, but Mum, people don't talk like you. She said, well, they should do. That was the end of the conversation. And I think what we're seeing, and I use that example deliberately, not to pull fun at my mother, but what we're seeing in language use and written language use in Amazon reviews, on eBay, whatever, even in newspapers these days, which does slightly irritate me, that the spelling of in the past modal as OF is an example of language change, and potentially may become acceptable in non-formal written language in the future. You know, much as Jennifer Jenkins has suggested that we're going to have informations.
Yes,
as,
I remember that one, reading this going.
Information. Yeah. So I think it's important that we remember that it's not only teaching that and teachers who need to develop, but we need to be mindful that the language is developing out of our control, and that the native teacher has even less say in being able to judge that change, because it's the international user of English who is actually now in the driving seat of where English is going to go in the future. That does put pressure, I think, on quote unquote non-native teachers to make decisions in terms of what is expected of their students if they're preparing for exams.
Exactly. But then an exam, there are, you suppose in certain exams, speaking exams, you are allowed, for example, accents, because it has to be, as long as it's a type of English. So, but you're right when it comes to writing. That's an iffy one.
Valentina in chat has written, and I think this is an interesting point, instead of is just bad grammar for me. Sorry, in writing, I mean. I think, Valentina, you know, there is no right or wrong here. I don't know if you'd agree, Cristina. It's simply a matter. Descriptive grammar will say of is becoming more common in native use as an alternative of have full stop. The descriptive will say that, whereas the prescriptive will say it's wrong. It's a bit like in France, l'Académie Française making judgment on what is and is not acceptable.
Yes, Franglish.
Yeah, we don't have that in the English-speaking world in the UK.
Yes, I mean, definitely. This is also, I mean, it's not only about grammar nowadays, it's also about pronunciation. You know, what is acceptable pronunciation, what we should even be teaching. You know, the whole, the old question when you teach in English, or even the spelling, organization, or is it an S or a Z? And you say, well, both technically. Okay, but which one's better? And you're like, well, doesn't matter. Does it? Just maybe be a little bit consistent. Don't keep changing from one to another. But the pronoun also, you know, you have different types of pronoun of English. It's the whole Englishes thing that we need to be aware of, and also the fact that language will evolve. Like you were saying, the example of the l'Académie Française, words that are English are not now accepted into the French language.
Software logiciel.
Exactly. So, and some people are fighting against it, but you're like, but why? Language will evolve. I mean, the whole point of English and the spelling, the weird spelling that English does have, comes from the history. The fact that you had so many different languages, and you took some of the spelling rules of one language, and then you took the spelling rules of the other, which makes me, when I explain to students and they go, but this makes no sense, and you go, well, English hates you, that's it. It's nothing to be done, you know, but try explaining to them the history, but it is very complex. So it is very hard. One has to, and it's true that as non-native, And Valentina, I do feel also that I do understand what you're saying about, oh, it feels wrong. But because as a non-native, even though I am okay with English, I'm all right when it comes to it. But as a non-native, I feel as if I have to be the defender of English rules. I have to be always 100% perfect, because otherwise somebody will go, you see, she's not that good in English, she shouldn't be here, she shouldn't be training me, she shouldn't. So there is the whole, and Neil, this goes back to what you were saying, even though it's not very politically correct, although I don't particularly agree, I think it is true, there's still this native non-native, that as non-native we have to fight for jobs. There's still jobs. I mean, I don't know, somebody said they were in Germany. I read somewhere that recently there was a lawsuit in Germany because they had advertised a job for native speakers, and somebody said, I'm sorry, why?
Yeah, Cristina and the legal case that she actually won the damages against a language school in Germany because they had refused to appoint her to a position, but she was a non-native teacher. And that's going to have major implications. I mean, again, it's really interesting. And I love the engagement that we get from people like Valentina in chat, where she writes, I'd be more tolerant about pronunciation because there are varieties of English. And most of EFL teachers are non-native, but I cannot bring myself to accept a preposition instead of a verb. And I think what my response to that is, okay, that's fine, but please understand that should of, OF, is a variety of English that should be understood in its social cultural context. There is some element of, well, there are two things going on, I think. Number one, it is a variety. It's a social cultural variety. More of that in a second. Number two, it's out there, it exists. If I was teaching a group of business people who were going to be writing high-level documents for public use at government level, I absolutely would correct of to have. I would also question the value of having a contraction in a written document.
Definitely not even acceptable at this stage.
I have sometimes myself in fora, online chat, written should of OF deliberately to fit in with the discourse. Because in terms of the social cultural aspect, there is a relationship, I think, between class, education, and sometimes you want to accommodate to the kind of people that you are working with. And I use text speak as an example. So my genuine example of using should of was in a context where I was communicating with a host family for a language school, and the way that they used English was reflective of their education and was reflective of their background. And I didn't want to come across as being the clever, super educated, hoity-toity teacher.
Elitist.
I just wanted to communicate an idea. So I adopted their language system, even though it's not the one I usually use, in order to be part of the conversation on their level. Does that mean to say I was misusing language, that I was using grammar mistakes, or that I was actually working with a particular register? Another example, if you go to Yorkshire, you will hear local people saying, I were reet glad. I was really happy. I were reet glad. I were. If you're teaching students in Yorkshire, do you tell them that all the local people are wrong, or do you say this is a local variety? Now, if your students aren't in Yorkshire, you won't even use that example. But isn't this an indication that should of OF or I were are valid varieties in their given contexts?
Yeah,
What do you think?
I mean, definitely there's an element of it's elitist. You know, when they talk about pronunciation and the Queen's English, well, the Queen's English is, and No disrespect to the Queen, we love her. We absolutely adore her. Long live the Queen. But I'm talking about what it represents. The accent represents not only, not only as a level of education, but also as a social status. But then you also have exactly the same when it comes to the grammar. Like, if you go in certain parts and then you start saying he says, just a simple thing. Well, the vast majority of people would say he say, or like Alexandra was saying in the chat, ax instead of ask.
Yeah.
So it is. Would you, while we are trying, I understand what Valentina is trying to say, but also we are teaching, whether or not you agree with the communicative approach, which we have already dealt with, and we were already discussing that, we shouldn't just choose one approach, but at the end of the day, we do want them to communicate. So shouldn't we not automatically teach should of, but also, but instead of teaching that, allow them to know that this exists, allow them to be able to communicate, and maybe not produce, but recognize that this exists, recognize that it is valid. So that's also this is the knowledge that we have to pass on for an effective communication. As you mentioned, Neil, the vast majority of English speakers are non-native nowadays. So but there's still this thing, oh, I speak like an English, like a native speaker. Well, yeah, but if you're gonna do that, then you need to know that what is in the book is not automatically what people do say, whether it's in Yorkshire, whether it's in Church Street, whether it is anywhere. So yes, definitely, I completely agree.
It's not just a phenomenon in English, is it?
No,
it's
God
a phenomenon in French, it's a phenomenon in Italian. I've just put an example into chat of a linguistic error that you will hear all over the place in Italy, where the subjunctive is not used in a periodo ipotetico conditional phrase. So correctly, se avessi saputo, non ci sarei andata, for a woman speaking, but you will hear se avevo saputo, non ci sarei andata. So I think what we're seeing here is perhaps a value in a tolerance of different forms, and an awareness and of a building of awareness for students, particularly if they're going to come into contact with those different forms, that the canonical prescriptive, you must say it like this, is quite different from what they may encounter in the country.
Definitely, it's awareness. So for all of those like Simon and Valentina that are saying, well, we wouldn't teach that in grammar lessons. Okay, don't teach it. Just as they progress. And I think Valentina said something that as language gets hard, as we speak, we learn more, then the language goes, it becomes more difficult, whether it's in English or in Spanish or in French. Well, then as you are teaching the rules, the prescriptive rule, also allow the students to have an awareness, to grow their awareness of the different Englishes that they might encounter, so that, remember, the goal being communication, so when they are communicating, it is smooth. They can actually relate, they understand, they see what it means, and also it will give them extra indication, social, cultural indication. So this is all good. At the end of the day, this is extra knowledge. So maybe don't teach it, but allow the awareness to be there for the students. I mean, that's very important, I think.
So here's a question for you, and I ask it, but I'm being entirely honest, I really have no idea. So we talked about acquisition order. We've talked about how the fact that as teachers, hopefully we know a little bit about language acquisition to understand that if you teach something one day, expect your students to get it wrong the next day, because that's how language learning works. So don't beat them up for having forgotten the difference between the form of the past simple and the present perfect and its meaning from one day to the next. But what about acquisition order in teaching? So Your point about, and it comes back to, I think, possibly something that Valentina asked right at the beginning. So if an applied linguist makes the distinction between 2 tenses in English and 22 other verb forms, and your point about you do CELTA and then you come along to Delta, you say, just basically forget everything we ever told you. We're going to just rebuild from scratch. Is that right? Or should we be honest with teachers earlier on in their... So if we tell them the simple things early on, it makes it manageable. But then they may have to rethink and relearn an awful lot. Is it more principled to introduce those points from very early on? Should we be talking about verb forms and tenses on CELTA? Should we be talking about different modal uses in a second conditional? Or should we just stick to past simple, would, and so on?
As teacher trainers, you're talking, right?
Yeah. So when do we let people into the secret? Do we tell them from the start, or do we withhold stuff? Because
because I don't withhold stuff myself on the CELTA. I mean, I'll be brutally frank with all of you guys. You know, the first part of what I've just done, my presentation about you know, the tenses, the difference between time and tense. This is one of the sessions I give on the CELTA at the end of my course, because I believe that and then this is something I always say to the trainers. Okay, the trainees, sorry. I will give you the rules. Apply them. These are the ones you will see in the course book. You will learn to break them. But in order to break the rules, you have to know what the rules are first. You can't just go otherwise it has no system. There's no system. Learn the rules, learn why you're doing this. Then as you progress, see and understand the reasoning why we can break those rules. Neil, the thing is, let's say, imagine we go with, you know, if we were to teach them from the beginning, guys, if I was to teach you from the beginning that listening should not be done first by gist and then listening to specific info, but on the contrary, you should start going into connected speech and think about how elision will you know, influence how they will hear. And this is how you build listening. The sheer amount of details that will go into that might be too much. So I think we should give them, as teachers, and I know it sounds a bit disingenuous, but we need to, we build the beginning, we give them the simple rules that they can apply the course book material on. Remember, this is a profession. At the end of the day, we want to get paid. We need to teach. So we allow the teachers to be able to teach according to the course books that the director of studies will give them. And then, but slowly, instead of Neil waiting for maybe another trainer, introduce the idea from the beginning that these are some of the rules now. You know, the same way we do in class when they say present perfect and they say, had been, isn't that also a tense? And you'll get, yes, but not for now, for later. So introduce again this idea of awareness, the same way we should raise awareness in our students that there are other rules. We should raise awareness in our teachers that there's more coming.
So a kind of a tolerance of ambiguity.
Exactly. The same way when you're watching a Hollywood, you know, suspension of disbelief, like here it's tolerance of ambiguity. Right. And I saw some things about Picasso. Picasso said that. I had no idea. Valentina, what's your question? Would the expression, would have be accepted in the first exam?
We talked about this earlier, didn't we?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's the whole idea. EAP will not allow it. That's the whole point. And I think Neil has something coming up on that.
Okay, so Cambridge First is okay.
Try that one.
Right, thank you. Cambridge First is an exam which necessarily, for it to be valid, for it to be reliable, has to have certain expectations of what is and what isn't acceptable. Now, let me give you an example, if I can only remember it. I have not been, I used to be a team leader for Cambridge First, back in the days when it was First Certificate. And it is absolutely the case that for the written test, would have been, it wouldn't have caused a huge amount of loss of marks in the writing test. In the use of English test, it would have been marked as incorrect. I remember a heated debate in an examiner's meeting looking at writing, where the part of the, this is a long time ago, it was where the first task was a transactional letter. It required you to ask how many people would be attending a party. And there was this this argument about how many of you are there, and no, there are 5 of us versus we are in 5. And there was a huge debate about whether we are in 5 was going to be accepted or actually marked as wrong. So it is the case that exams are at the cutting edge of debate, and that examiners are going to be split down the middle. That's the nature of exams that are marked by people. I would encourage you for an exam to go down the route of the pedagogical grammar of would have.
But do you say that's only for writing or for speaking? Because for speaking, that would be a different ball game.
For speaking, and there was an additional problem here that I would absolutely definitely be looking at, as long as it was appropriate for a contraction to be used, which in the context of Cambridge First, the interactional discussion would be preferable to would have.
Exactly, because that's the whole thing, Valentina, is that you have to distinguish the fact in AAP is that you have the written part where, you know, it tends to be quite, the register is slightly different. You do not accept, you know, contractions, and of would be a problem. But in spoken, the spoken part of the exam, on the contrary, that would show a better mastery of the language than saying should have, you know, the aspects of connected speech, the aspects of fluency and all that. So that's actually something that we think is quite easy and straightforward to answer. Is actually quite tricky, because we have to look at the different components of that exam. And I think that's true for, and I speak as an examiner, and so do you, Neil. It's true for most, I mean, higher level exams.
And I appreciate that you're setting me up terribly nicely for doing a terrible self-plug for a forthcoming Gallery Teachers Masterclass. I don't know if Gabby can confirm the dates later this year, possibly in June, where in fact what I'm going to be looking at is this whole issue of the differences between spoken language and written language, the differences between general English and academic English. Now, first certificate fits into the general English end of things. IELTS is in the middle, genuine EAP. We would probably, as I think I said in the chat, really be focusing on noun grammar, which could be something that's entirely new to many of you if you've never taught academic English, rather than looking at verb grammar. Because as you said, I think the ratio of 7:2 for academic English between past and present and past is that academic language tends to talk about things which are established facts based on evidence, are, and anything which is in the realm of not yet clear. So the modality of potentially, could be, may suggest. And therefore, when you're designing a course, and I thought you expressed this beautifully, when we're thinking about if we're going to teach noun or if we're going to teach verb grammar, which are two entirely different things, we do need to consider, well, which tenses are useful? If you're teaching a first certificate course where there is a story, you absolutely need to teach the narrative. I mean, you know, course books, I've just done it myself, narrative tenses. But actually what we mean is those verb forms that allow the descriptive power of a man walked into a dark wood at night. He had seen shadows around the trees. You're building up suspense.
You want to know the end of the story. Come on.
Yeah. Whereas you just don't need that for academic English. So basically, why teach it? Likewise, I teach a lot of medical English. And if you actually start looking at the range of tenses required for a medical English referral letter, they're relatively restricted. So why teach them all?
Exactly. I mean, it is. I mean, Valentina said something about my bad. Nah, yeah.
You say that.
My bad.
My bad.
Yeah, yes, I don't, but maybe just.
I said it yesterday.
Yeah, I know, but incorrigibly. But yeah, but no, I always felt, I don't know, maybe because where I you know, where I was raised there, we didn't say my bad. We just said, I don't actually, what would they say? Sorry, mate. That'd be it. Sorry, mate. But we wouldn't say my bad. It seems a bit American to me. But then again, you know, mate would be okay. Oh, you know, that's I don't. But then again, that's just colloquial English. It's absolutely fine. And I think, and this is something interesting, I think we should be able to teach these things a little bit more colloquial, you know, kind of like you know, English in the lesson, and the whole socio-cultural aspect goes into that, and showing them a little bit that it's not going to be, oh, I'm terribly sorry. Which I'm sorry, I'm not going to be saying that anytime soon. But you should teach them, and you know, and this goes into something that we had a bit of the discussion on when we were discussing visual literacy in a previous gallery teacher masterclass, which was, what is the role of the teacher? Should the teacher also teach that social cultural aspect, or is it too much on us? But then again, we need to express. Yeah, exactly. But also and also what you were saying, Neil, is the needs analysis. Medical English equals a certain amount, certain types of verb forms or verb forms to be taught. That is completely different from the needs analysis of something completely different. Are we getting
the lovely one from Valentina at the bottom? And I love the questions she's posing us, this thing about the use of like for reported speech.
Yes. Well, what's your take on that?
I posted in a Facebook discussion group, Cambridge English had put up a little, I think maybe it was on LinkedIn, I forget, this thing about how do you teach reported speech? And I caused an absolute riot inadvertently by saying, well, I don't, because I don't think it's very useful.
Oh, why not? Let's just start that conversation. So what was your...
It's a phenomenon that exists in exams that teaches tense shift that frankly rarely happens.
Yeah.
So I will teach reported speech if I'm teaching on a program where reported speech is a requirement. I will teach reported speech if I have students who need to report.
Yeah.
So in ELT,
journalism.
Yes. Use of direct quotations, use of reporting verbs as lexical items to give nuance, the difference between she said, she stated, she claimed. And that use of the reporting verb, absolutely critical in EAP and in journalism. Whereas I think in terms of, and Valentina, this is maybe the difference. I'm here in the UK. The students that I teach, not all of them, but many of them are in the UK or want to come to the UK to work as medics. So they are going to hear really frequently, he's like, well, who would have guessed that? Rather than, and he said, who would have said that? So I actually do teach like, because my students will be exposed to it as a relatively high frequency item. If I was teaching in a liceo scientifico, liceo classico, year 10, preparing for maturità or leading up to maturità, I would probably not mention it unless I was taking a group of students with me on a short vacanze studio to Cardiff, when I'd say your homestays may well say like. Here's a couple of examples. What do you think it means?
Again, it's raising that awareness of what is out there. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, my daughter her first language is English, because I didn't see the point of making her, learn French as a first language. And she just recently had something, and she said, "Mom, what's that reported speech?" And she said, "It's that new lesson. I have no idea what that is." And she's native, she is native. She's not like bilingual like me. She's native. And I was like, I was trying to explain it to her, and she was like, "Oh, okay, but why?" And I was like, getting old. "Oh, well, I'll tell you why." But it's true at the end of the day. And this just, Neil, when you were saying, and I was like, yeah, why? I mean, when was the last time I ever heard her use the reported speech? That is true. And this goes back, Neil, to what we were saying, is the whole course book is that little garden. And even at a lower level, you have to start thinking not only about adapting the material, adapting the approach, which might take a little bit more confidence and knowledge, but at a lower level, even, at the beginning of a teacher training session, you have to start thinking, do I really want to teach that point? Should I just take it away and concentrate on something a little bit better? And this goes into the whole needs, and this is something we never do because we are just assigned a course. But needs analysis, even when assigned a course with a course book, is still something that we should be thinking of all the time. This will save us a lot of hurdles later on in the course, if we were just to take those 10 minutes. And I know it's not really the subject of the masterclass today, but this does go back to the point that you need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. So in terms of trying to bring everything together, I mean, we're never going to have the definitive last statement on how one should teach grammar and what one should teach. But if we can try and kind of wrap it all up, what for you are I say three, it doesn't have to be three, but what are the kind of the core points that you hope people will take away from today's masterclass?
What I'd like people to take away is that what's in the course book is useful. And I will never take that away from people. You need the course book, but you need, the main thing I want people to take away is that you will as a teacher, you will never stop learning. It's not just your students that will be learning. You will never stop learning, because as you start seeing more, as you start teaching more, you have to start questioning more the content of what you're teaching, the way you are teaching, everything. I'm not saying question everything and then change everything. I'm just saying, be aware that you need to question. Be aware that there are other things out there than what you are being told all the time, and do your research. I mean, all this comes from different courses I took as a participant, articles I read, even though it's online, and God knows I hate reading online. So my main thing, I'm sorry, I'm showing my age. The main takeaway is that keep learning, even grammar, something that seems so dated and so ingrained and so unmovable. Well, this can change, and this is changing, and you can still learn new things even if you think you knew everything about it.
Language is a dynamic system, teaching is a dynamic system, modesty, that we don't know everything. We shouldn't beat ourselves up because we can't know everything, and actually love the fact. I mean, I've been asked in my career, I mean, I'm a teacher, I'm a teacher trainer. I've been doing this for 30 years, and really regularly now I get asked questions and I was like, I don't have a clue. One was, and here's something to leave people with, and they're going to hate me now, but so I hope this doesn't keep you up at night. I'm just going off to have my shower, where m means my. But why do we have a personal pronoun there in the first place? And the other one, which totally stumped me, was what is the meaning of the verb form in the sentence, my car won't start this morning. Why won't rather than can't?
Yeah, it's true, because it's not an intention. It's not,
Right.
yeah. Oh, that actually will keep me up for a little while.
That's,
Sorry, bit of a grammar nerd here. Yes, that might actually keep
yeah,
me up.
my car won't start.
Yeah, that
And the
one's
context of
killing
that
me.
was, and it's to do with a very, very rarely described in any grammars use of will for talking about a mechanical object working or not working in the present.
That's an actual rule.
It's I don't know if I like the word rule generally. It's an observation of language in use. It's a usage.
That's interesting, because maybe that's where should have came from. It never started as something that people were allowed to say, prescriptive grammar, but then people kept saying it so much that it came to be accepted. That'd be actually very interesting to learn the origin of that. But but somebody did say something. It's because they doesn't want to. That's it.
No, sorry, that might have been a pronunciation point. It's won't. The will not. The other one, the shower, we decided, and this was a group of 15 CELTA trainers together in a room. We decided it was to do with indicating routine. I'm having my breakfast. I'm having my shower. It's to do with the sense of familiarity with the time at which you do it in the activity. So it became personalized, but it was indicative of a routine.
Goodness me, time on your hand.
So you would never say, I don't think, I'm having my gallery teachers masterclass as a
routine.
speaker, but it's not part of our routine. But you might, as wise people do, people who watch gallery teachers might say to their family, don't disturb me for the next hour. I'm watching my gallery teacher session.
Especially the next one with Neil.
2 weeks. There you go.
Especially the next one with Neil about what you described.
Bless you. Thank you.